My name is Maya Sheffield, and for most of my life, my family treated my accomplishments like background noise. A few weeks ago I decided to test that one last time. I dropped a message into our family group chat saying I'd been invited to receive a national award, that the ceremony would be broadcast live, and that it would mean a lot if they showed up or at least tuned in. I watched the typing bubble flicker, bracing myself. My sister answered first. She laughed at the text, called it a stupid award, and said she was going to a concert instead. A moment later my mom chimed in. Then my dad added the line that stuck with me. "Don't blame us if we don't go." Like my biggest night was some optional errand I was trying to guilt them into. I read their messages twice. I didn't argue, didn't explain what the award actually was, didn't tell them who would be in that room or how many people would be watching. I just smiled, typed a single word, "All right," and put my phone face down on the table. That decision changed everything. The night of the ceremony, their concert tickets didn't stop what happened next. While they were screaming along to songs, my name was being read out on live television, my face filling the screens above their heads. And suddenly, everyone around them knew exactly who I was, long before my own family really did. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. Oh, understand how all of this could happen. You have to know what it was like growing up in the Sheffield house. On paper, we looked like any other family in a quiet Las Vegas neighborhood. In reality, our roles were set long before I was old enough to notice. I was the kid who handled things, the one teachers never had to worry about. My older sister, Chloe Sheffield, was the person everyone revolved around. If Chloe had a game, a rehearsal, a new obsession, the week bent around her schedule. My younger brother, Logan Sheffield, was the baby who got away with almost everything as long as he kept people laughing. My mom, Laura Sheffield, liked to joke that she had a star, a helper, and a comedian. She never meant it to be cruel, but it told you exactly where I stood. My dad, David Sheffield, worked long hours and came home ready to hear about Chloe's latest big thing. I learned early that if I wanted time with him, I needed to wait until after she finished telling her stories. It started small. A project I was proud of would be pushed aside because Chloe had a tournament coming up. I would mention something from class and my dad would nod, then turn to ask about Chloe's practice. When Logan cracked a joke, everyone turned to him. When I spoke, people used that moment to refill drinks or clear plates. None of this was dramatic enough to point at and call unfair. It was a series of quiet choices that taught me my news came second. I stopped trying to compete with Chloe's performances and Logan's antics. I became the one who fixed problems before anyone else noticed them. If a document needed a signature, I made sure it was ready. If the Wi-Fi dropped, I rebooted the router. If my parents missed an appointment, I flagged it for them. The more dependable I became, the less they actually saw me. They appreciated the outcomes, not the person creating them. I was a useful system, not a daughter with a life of her own. By high school, I almost never shared anything unless a teacher required a parent meeting and the praise had to come through them. Chloe was 3 years older and her world always had spectators. Coaches, choir leaders, even neighbors talked about her with a kind of energy that made my parents beam. When someone ran into us at the grocery store and asked about the family, they opened with Chloe's latest performance and Logan's humor. I usually stayed out of it unless they pressed for more. I convinced myself I did not need attention. I leaned into the one thing that belonged to me: fixing problems quietly. I gravitated toward work where results mattered more than recognition, where I could stay invisible and let outcomes speak. It fit the version of me my family had shaped. The one who stepped in softly, handled issues, and disappeared before anyone noticed. Time passed that way. Birthdays, holidays, and reunions followed the same script. Chloe's plans drove everything. Logan coasted on charm. He kept the wheels turning. If I mentioned a success, it landed as a small, polite note before attention swung back to whatever Chloe had that week. When the national award opportunity first surfaced, it did not feel real. It began with an email from a committee asking follow-up questions about a project my team had finished. I replied and went straight back to work. Even when they wrote again to say I had made the shortlist, I did not hurry to tell my parents. I already knew how that talk would sound. So I kept it to myself while the process continued. There were calls, interviews, and long forms asking me to explain why the work mattered. People from the organization spoke with my boss and collaborators who had seen the impact firsthand. Each step pushed things forward and still I said nothing at home. The The formal invitation showed up one afternoon while I was between meetings. It listed the ceremony date, the venue, and that it would be filmed and broadcast. My name sat there in a way I had never seen, attached to something that could not be brushed off as a minor personal win. I stared at that email for a long time. For once, I had something my family could not easily shrink, a moment that would exist whether they cared or not. For a short while, it belonged only to me. By the time that invitation arrived, my work had already been quietly reshaping my life for years. I landed in emergency communications because it was the one place where my habit of dissecting everything became an advantage. I joined a small team building software for cities, tools designed to cut seconds from response times when people called for help. My role was the routing engine, the part that tracked traffic flows, hospital capacity, and call history, then suggested where each ambulance should head next. In a city like Las Vegas, where the lights never shut off and sirens never really pause, a few seconds can separate fear from disaster. Most of what I did lived in code repositories no one outside the office would ever see. I spent long nights combing through call logs and sensor data, hunting for strange patterns that could slow a crew. When the system worked, there were no headlines and no applause. A dispatcher's screen lit up with a clean recommendation. A crew reached the right door sooner and life kept going. The first person who treated that work as more than background noise was Dr. Selma Rodas, the head of our research group. She noticed that I volunteered for the messiest data, the tangled cases that made other people tune out. Instead of telling me to slow down, she pulled me into long talks about system design and where things break. She said plainly that my need to understand every layer was an advantage. Under her guidance, our work began as a low-key pilot in one corner of the city. Once the software went live, internal metrics started to move. Average response times dropped. Fewer calls bounced between stations. Dispatchers sent short notes after brutal weekends saying they felt less powerless. We read every message, patched what failed, and expanded the system a little more each quarter until the maps stretched across the entire valley. The nomination did not come from anyone in our office. A regional coordinator pulled a year of data, built visuals showing how many people received care sooner, and sent the full package to a national committee that monitored public safety innovation. I had no idea my name was even being discussed until Selma asked me to step into a conference room one afternoon and shut the door. She said the committee wanted to speak with the person who designed the core of the routing engine and that every arrow in their materials led to me. There would be interviews, she said, and a long evaluation process I would mostly hear about indirectly. I felt the familiar instinct to brush it off. In my head, it was still just code, just patterns, just me doing the work no one else wanted to stare at for that many hours. Selma did not let me minimize it. She reminded me of overnight shifts spent glued to live dashboards. Of the stubborn bug that swallowed an entire weekend, of the call from a dispatcher who broke down because the new system had positioned a crew just in time. If recognition came, she said, it would not be about clever math but about refusing to abandon a problem until it worked. The review dragged on for months. The committee sent lists of questions that forced me to explain our work without jargon. They asked for anonymized timelines of calls handled under the new system. They wanted to understand in human terms what it meant when an ambulance arrived minutes sooner on a packed weekend night. At the office, we kept shipping updates and responding to incidents while the decision hovered somewhere far above us. It was easier to focus on the next rollout than to imagine a room full of people with my name on their agenda. When the official email finally arrived, I had to read it twice before it registered. A federal agency seal sat at the top. The message said I had been selected for a National Public Safety Innovation Award, that the ceremony would take place in a downtown hotel ballroom, and that the program would be recorded and broadcast as part of a larger event honoring different kinds of service. There was a line about inviting guests, a short note about potential media attention, and a link to a scheduled dance with security details. For a full day, I kept the news inside our building. I forwarded the email to Selma and my manager. People stopped by my desk with stunned smiles and awkward high fives. Someone printed the invitation and taped it to the break room fridge. My team lead joked about practicing posture in case a camera swept our row. Selma squeezed my shoulder and said softly that the award did not change who I was. It only meant others were finally being made to notice what I had been doing in plain view. It was not until that night, sitting alone at my kitchen table with the packets spread out, that the section about guests stopped feeling abstract. In the middle of the page was one simple sentence. You may invite up to 4 family members or friends. I stared at it long enough for the ice in my drink to disappear. I imagined empty seats under my name. I pictured my parents and Chloe under the neon lights of the strip, completely unaware of what was happening across town. Part of me wanted to keep it to myself like every other win that never fit their definition of important. Another part, smaller and angrier, wanted them to see it whether they understood it or not. By the time the desert sky went fully dark, I had decided. I opened the family chat, wrote a careful invitation, and sent it before I could shrink it into something they could dismiss. The night of the ceremony came faster than I expected. By late afternoon, I was in a downtown hotel room, standing in front of a full-length mirror as a stylist pinned the final edge of a dark dress into place. The invite specified formal attire, the kind of refined look I usually only saw during televised ceremonies and charity galas. Under the warm glow of the hotel lights, I looked like a version of myself I barely recognized. Someone people might pause on before looking away. Downstairs, the event was already in motion. Security badges, registration desks, and glossy programs turned the lobby into a carefully managed maze. Staff in headsets moved smoothly between groups. Everyone there stood for a different kind of service. Public health, education, infrastructure, emergency response. My name appeared in the middle section of the program, nestled between people I had only ever read about in internal reports. I followed the steps the organizers had drilled into us during rehearsal. Greet the coordinator. Hand over your phone briefly while they verified credentials. Step in front of a banner crowded with logos for a quick photo. Snorts. Accept a badge with my name and the word honoree printed beneath it. Then a staffer guided me into the ballroom where cameras waited on silent tripods. The room felt unreal. Round tables filled the space, each marked with small cards. A low stage stretched along the far wall with a simple podium centered on it. Above us, 3 massive screens hung like extra walls, ready to show names, footage, and the live broadcast everyone kept mentioning. I knew one of those screens would show my face later. I also knew exactly who would not be sitting in the rows below it. Our section was near the center of the room. Selma took the seat beside me, steady and composed in a simple black suit, untouched by the sparkle around us. Members of my team arrived with wide eyes, squeezing my hand or nudging my shoulder as they sat. For a brief stretch, the noise dissolved. All I felt was the weight of the moment pressing in from every direction. The program opened with speeches from officials who treated a stage like this as familiar ground. They spoke about service, sacrifice, and the unseen work that kept cities running. I listened half there, half elsewhere. I tried not to imagine my parents and Chloe walking through the doors. Tried not to picture them slipping into the empty seats beside my coworkers. I had sent the invitation. They had decided. Tonight was not about what was missing. When the emergency services category was announced, my focus snapped back. A short video rolled across the screens showing dispatchers at their stations, crews cutting through traffic, satellite shots of city grids glowing at night. A narrator explained our software in careful, accessible terms. My name was mentioned once, calm and precise, and I felt Selma's elbow brush mine. Then the host read from his card, describing a routing system that had reduced average ambulance response times across the Las Vegas Valley. He spoke about reaching people faster, about how seconds mattered when someone called for help. Finally, he said my full name and asked me to come forward. Walking to the podium felt like pushing through water. Applause swelled and blurred into a single sound. The lights washed out the crowd, leaving only shapes and flashes. I took a glass plaque that caught the light and shook hands with someone whose title I recognized, though their face felt distant. A photographer captured the moment where I smiled without fully believing it was real. In the back of my mind, another scene played out. I could almost see my family across town at the concert venue, already seated as the band wrapped up a song. I imagined the hallway screens rotating ads before cutting briefly to a news segment about the event I was standing in. I pictured my own face flashing between beer promos and tour dates, my name scrolling along the bottom of a feed they never bothered to ask about. After I left the podium and slid back into my seat, the rest of the program moved around me like a movie I had already watched. More names, more clapping, more stories about work that usually stayed invisible. My phone, silent in my bag, buzzed once as it caught the building's signal again. Somewhere else in the city, another set of screens lit up and my family finally saw the thing they had been too busy to attend. When the program wrapped and the cameras shut off, the ballroom drained into soft echoes and the clink of glassware. I picked up my phone from the check-in table and felt it vibrating nonstop in my hand, the screen filling with notifications faster than I could clear them. Most of them were expected. Messages from coworkers, emails from city offices, a long thread in our operations channel where someone had posted a blurry screenshot of me on stage. Buried beneath all of that were dozens of missed calls from the same 4 numbers and a flood of unread texts in the family chat. The timestamp on the first surge matched exactly when the concert would have paused. I opened the thread and let it jump. At the top sat my invitation, quiet and easy to miss. Below it, Chloe's reply brushing off the award like a pointless chore, and my parents backing her up. Under that, everything shifted. Laura's messages came in anxious blocks, talking about giant screens over the arena and people turning to stare when my name appeared. David wrote about strangers asking if they were related to me, adding lines about how proud they felt and how unreal it all was. Chloe's texts were shorter and sharper, packed with exclamation points that made it feel like a show for an unseen audience. I read every message slowly. They described the noise in the venue when the ceremony clip aired, how nearby fans tried to snap photos of the broadcast, the questions that followed when the caption under my image spelled out my job title. No one mentioned choosing a concert over being in the room. They talked about shock and pride and disbelief, as if the only thing that mattered was how dramatic the reveal had been. For a second, an old habit kicked in, the urge to smooth it over and make everyone comfortable. I could almost feel myself typing reassurances, explaining the project in simple terms, redirecting attention away from their choice and toward how exciting everything sounded. My thumbs hovered over the screen while that version played out in my head. Instead, I locked the phone and lowered it. My team was waiting at the table, caught between celebration and the exhaustion that follows a long push. Selma raised an eyebrow when she noticed my expression and how tightly I held the phone. I shook my head once, not ready to go there, and let myself focus on the small practical pieces of the night, finishing the group photo, thanking organizers, figuring out which rideshare line to stand in outside the hotel. By the time I got home, the city had started to settle. I set the plaque on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and opened the phone again. The unread counts had grown. Alongside the family thread were messages from distant relatives, old classmates, neighbors from the cul-de-sac where I grew up. Links to news clips sat under their notes, all talking about how surreal it was to see my face during a night out on the strip. Back in the family chat, the tone had shifted again. The frantic shock of the first wave had cooled into something more deliberate. Laura was asking whether the local news might want to speak with them about what it had been like raising such a devoted daughter. My dad wondered out loud if the city would want a piece about the neighborhood I came from. Chloe floated the idea of posting an old photo of us as kids with a caption about always believing in me. I scrolled until I reached the part where their fresh excitement sat right above the lines where they had shrugged off my invitation. Then I took a set of screenshots and saved them in a folder with a name only I would understand. I did not answer. The distance between what they were saying now and what they had said before did not feel like something a few late-night messages could erase. Outside my window, the strip glowed in its usual colors, indifferent to who had been applauded in ballrooms or concert venues that night. Inside my living room, for the first time in a long time, I let myself sit with what their words actually meant. Morning arrived without caring what kind of day I needed. I woke to sunlight slipping past the blinds and the faint buzz of my phone on the nightstand. For a moment, I assumed it was just the normal stream of work emails. Another loop of small problems that needed quiet fixes. Then I saw the same cluster of names near the top of the screen, mixed in with senders I had not heard from in years. I set the phone face down and went to make coffee. The calm of my apartment felt delicate, something I had to guard before I let other people's reactions in. When the mug was warm in my hands, I sat at the table and unlocked the phone. Reporters were already circling. 2 local stations asked for interviews. A regional outlet wanted to film at our office. My department's communications team had sent guidance about handling requests, reminding me I did not owe anyone a yes just because they showed up with a camera. Below that thread, the family chat icon still lit up. When I opened it again, the overnight pattern was obvious. After the first shock, my parents slid straight into strategy. They wondered which relatives to call, which neighbors would be most impressed, whether any journalist might want video of the street where I grew up. Chloe's messages read like captions for public posts, polished nostalgia, and claims about always knowing I was headed for something big. Logan tossed in a few scattered reactions, like he was trying to stay upright without choosing a side. I scrolled past everything until I reached the empty line at the bottom. Anything I wrote there would be reread and stitched into whatever version of us they wanted to sell. The difference now was that I finally understood I got to decide how much access they had to the version of me the world had just met. I typed slowly, rereading each line before I let it stay. I kept it brief. I acknowledged the ceremony was a big moment, that yes, it was surreal seeing my face on screens in places I had never even been. Then I set a boundary. I said I did not want interviews framed around our home life, that I would not take part in features about my childhood, that any story I agreed to share would center on the work and on the people who relied on it. I also said it hurt to watch them scramble for ways to benefit from something they had been so fast to dismiss. I did not repeat their earlier messages. I did not have to. They were still sitting in the scroll, and the people most committed to ignoring them were the ones who had typed them. I ended by asking them not to contact my co-workers or anyone in the department, and by saying that if a reporter approached them, I hoped they would choose honesty over image. When I hit send, the typing bubble showed up almost instantly. For a few seconds it blinked on and off like no one could decide who should go first. Finally, my mom's reply came through in a tight block of text that tried to cover every angle at once. She insisted they were simply excited, that they were proud in their own way, that I was doing what I always did and reading too much into it. My dad replied next, shorter and tighter. He said I should not tell them how to speak about their own daughter, that they had given up plenty over the years, and that he did not appreciate being cast as a bad guy on a night meant to be celebratory. Chloe did not send a long explanation. She shot back a handful of messages instead, each sharper than the one before, accusing me of being ungrateful, of trying to shame them, of acting like I had grown up without help. Their words hit with far less weight than they would have even a year earlier. Instead of pulling me back into old doubts, they sounded like noise from a place I had already left. I read them, waited to see if any part of me wanted to dive back into the familiar debate about who owed what to whom, and felt only a calm, exhausted clarity. I closed the chat without answering and reopened the email from our communications team. Attached was a brief media guide about setting limits and not feeling pressured to share details that felt uncomfortable. Near the end was a sentence explaining that the people closest to us are sometimes the least prepared for public attention and that creating distance can be healthy. Reading that, I understood I did not need to wait for anyone else to change. Distance was not punishment. It was a position I could choose. I went back to the family thread one final time and muted it for a full year. Snorts. Then I opened each individual conversation and turned off their alerts as well. Messages could still come through if they sent them, but my space would stay quiet unless I chose otherwise. The weeks that followed did not feel triumphant. They felt like a reset. At work, the award became a kind of shorthand. New hires had to be told why unfamiliar faces sometimes appeared with cameras. Dispatchers stopped me in the hallway to share details I never saw on a dashboard. A child who made it to a hospital before a seizure escalated. An elderly neighbor who did not spend the night on the floor because a crew arrived fast enough to help her up. Selma used the attention to argue for more funding, more hires, more relentless people who hated unsolved problems as much as I did. Within that forward motion, my personal life reshaped itself around quieter decisions. I kept my number but removed the family thread from my home screen. I had dinners with coworkers who had become friends, people who understood the cost of the project and did not need me to downplay it for their comfort. I met with students touring the department, answered their questions about burnout and meaning, and told them honestly that the work mattered more than any headline. From time to time, pieces of my old life leaked through. Someone mentioned my parents had framed a news clipping and hung it in their living room. A neighbor from back home messaged to say my mom talked about me constantly at block gatherings, always leaving out the part where she skipped the ceremony. Once, a distant cousin forwarded a long email my dad had written about raising a daughter who never asked for much, as if that distance were something to brag about. I read those updates the way you read a weather report for a city you no longer plan to visit. They described conditions that could not affect me unless I chose to step back into them. I did not. Chloe tried another approach. When she realized I was not replying in the group chat, she started posting about me online, tagging my account in old photos and writing sentimental captions about always believing in her little sister. I sent her one clear message, the first I had sent in months, saying plainly that I did not want our relationship framed that way, and that if she kept going I would block her everywhere and involve the department's legal team if needed. She removed the tags. He kept posting just without my name. That was what consequences looked like in my world. No scenes, no blow-ups, just doors closing quietly. My parents could still brag to anyone who would listen, but they no longer had direct access to me. Chloe could play nostalgia for an audience, but she could not rewrite what actually happened. Logan could stay neutral for as long as he wanted, but the way back into my everyday life had closed the night they decided a concert mattered more than being there. What stayed open were the parts of my life I chose on purpose. I kept building the routing system and the projects that grew out of it. I volunteered to mentor interns who reminded me of the kid I once was, sitting alone in a bedroom teaching a computer how to listen. I joined a small group that reviewed near misses and tried to learn from each one, not because a committee might notice, but because somewhere on the other end of a call, a stranger was waiting. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not that success repairs the past or that public praise heals private neglect. It does neither. The real shift happened when I stopped treating my family's attention like a prize I had to earn again and again. I built a life where the people closest to me knew what I did, cared why it mattered, and showed up long before any camera ever did. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. You are allowed to draw your own lines. You are allowed to decide which invitations count and which do not. You are allowed to step away from people who only remember your value when someone else spells it out for them on a screen. Distance is not cruelty when it is what keeps you whole. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this story. If it made you think about your own boundaries or how you value the people around you, take a moment after this video to check in with yourself and with the person in your life who might still be waiting for someone to show up when there are no lights and no applause.